Thanks, Mark. That was a great reading. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Here we go into class number 3. We have seen that God is going to bring us into difficult times, and yet God conquers those challenging times. And ultimately now what we're going to see here in class number 3 is that is because he is faithful. And I think that is one of the most awesome, exciting things about our God to think about. I would suggest that maybe you have had this experience, but for a long time I never thought about God being faithful. And part of that is because in the KJV, it's somewhat translated out of the text. I don't think it was on purpose. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy or anything like that. But it's our word emet, which is the word truth. So if you think about Exodus 34 and the character of God, it's merciful, gracious, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, emet. And you'll notice that if you read newer translations, it will say all those other things, and it'll say abundant in goodness and faithfulness. Now, it's a fascinating kind of concept to think about, God describing himself as faithful. And I think that's something for us to spend this next hour on, just thinking about what does it mean that God is faithful to his people? What does it mean that God is faithful to us, to our families, to us personally? How does that fit with him being a faithful God? So, consider that. That's the big lesson of this class now. Now, yes, we did have a one-verse reading, and we are actually going to talk about just this one verse. And let me show you why. Oh, look at that. My clicker got sad. Okay, give me a second to fix this. Okay. Fine. We'll do it like this. Okay. Hey. Aw, man. Okay, I think I need a new battery. Anybody have a AAA? Or a new clicker? Look at that. Thank you. Yeah, nice. Oh, keyboard setup. Wow, this is very exciting. Okay, I think that'll be okay. Oh, yeah. All right. There we go. All right, now this class better be good. You had to wait for a while, so here we go. So, yes, we are looking at this one verse. We are here in our series, class number 3, so we've reached now the middle of trying to understand what's going on in the Olivet prophecy, and I recognize there's a lot of stuff happening in the Olivet prophecy, and there's a lot of things that we skipped, because unfortunately we haven't been able to consider them all. That's okay. If you want to talk to me about them later, I'm happy to go into some of those other signs and whatnot, but really, we need to spend a lot of time here on verse 29, and the reason is, as you'll see in this first section, there's differing views. So depending on who you'll talk to, you'll get a different idea. And I think that's something that's important to be aware of. So we'll discuss those differing views. We're then going to discuss the Jewish heavens, and then we're going to see Christ's Old Testament basis. The main message is that God is faithful. Our why question is, why did the Lord use symbolic language to describe the Jewish nation? And I would suggest to you, as we'll see as we go, that he was hearkening back to prophecies in the Old Testament. But why? Why would he want to do that? So, we'll consider that. Now, I have 3 quotes for you up here. 2 of them are from people that are not alive anymore, and the third one is not attributed because it is someone who's alive, and I felt like, since I'm going to disagree with them, that it wasn't very nice for me to say who they were. So anyway, these are some of the different views that you will hear within the Christadelphian community, and I'd like you to note that these are all views of verse 29, specifically. right? So verse 29 is where you get a lot of disagreement within Christadelphia, and sometimes people get like super excited about this actually, and excited by which I mean angry. So it's the kind of thing that like, it's just good to be aware of and good to know about. So take a look at this one. This is from John Alfrey from his book, The Lord's Mount Olivet Prophecy. Of verse 29, he says, "There is described by Jesus an unbroken chain of events that links Matthew 24:29 with the events of AD 70. So fairly straightforward. He says 24:29 is AD 70. That's it. And then he goes on to try and prove that. This next one is H.P. Mansfield. Notice what he does here. He says, "It will be seen that the sun, moon, and stars in this portion of it relate to the Gentiles." So that would be the sun, moon, and stars of verse 29. So he's saying that's not the Jews, it's the Gentiles. That applies even to Matthew's statement. The word immediately would seem to link his comments with those that precede them, and which relate to the overthrow of AD 70, but the word can be rendered suddenly and perhaps relates to the suddenness by which current events will develop at the time of the end. So you'll notice HP takes this completely the other way. So John Alfrey says it's all AD 70. HP says it might sound like AD 70, but actually it's all about the second coming of Christ. Now, ready for this one? Look at this. The Olivet prophecy up to Matthew 24:29a and Mark 13:25a and Luke 21:24a is unquestionably about the events of AD 70, which I think is funny considering that clearly people had questions about this. But, we'll just leave that there. However, from Matthew 24:29b, Mark 13:25b, and Luke 21:24b, the Lord shifts to the latter days. So do you see what this third option is? The third option is the verse actually divides in the middle. So option number 3 would be the first portion of the verse is AD 70, whereas the second portion is the second coming. Now, I don't know. I think that's something that's possible, but I do feel like when we start splitting verses in half, that can start to be challenging. So, what is actually going on? Which is it? Well, let's spend some time. Let me show you my thought here. I would suggest to you that the word immediately is a very difficult one to get around. So since it says immediately after the tribulation of those days in verse 29, and it is continuing from verse 28, I think the normal way to read that would be to say, oh, it probably means immediately after the tribulation of those days. I think that's reasonable. Now, you might have noticed in what HP said is that he said this word sometimes is translated as suddenly. Now, I will tell you, I haven't seen that. So it doesn't appear to mean suddenly. It does mean immediately. It does mean this happens very closely to something else. But I haven't seen surprise sort of thing. Like, that's not really a type of thing that it seems to bring out. So you can see the verses there, Matthew 4:22, Mark 1:21, Galatians 1:16. Those are all examples of how this word definitely means immediately. And therefore, I could not find any translation that says suddenly. Now, I know that we could work through the Greek too, and I'll just put it out there. Knowing Greek, I can't see any way that it can mean suddenly, right? So that's that. Okay. Now, if you look at Mark seems to make this even more clear because here's Mark's version, right? You can't say that this means suddenly because Mark, in those days, after that tribulation. What days? Probably the days he had just talked about, right? Unless you are making something up or you're saying, oh, he means the days that he's about to talk about. That's kind of hard. So in those days, to me, sounds like he's saying, look, this is AD 70, and then your Greek here, it's hemerai akenai, that means those days, and he uses it over and over and over, that exact phrase, about the events of AD 70. So Mark 13:17, woe to them that are with child in those days, exact same phrase. Mark 13:19, for in those days shall be affliction. Mark 13:20, except the Lord had shortened those days. Same phrase, all 3 times, about AD 70. Okay, I know I'm kind of, this might be a dead horse. But I think this is important considering there's a lot of just different ideas here. Now, by the way, right, I'd just like to point out that this is a helpful quote as well. So, we've read ideas. Here is what John Thomas wrote in 1853. Having ascertained that the great tribulation or distress in the land and wrath upon Israel was concurrent with the lifetime of the disciples who were taught by the Lord himself, we are obliged to fix, so now he's about to talk about verse 29, the eclipse and fall of the political luminaries, by which he means the sun being darkened, at that crisis. In other words, he saw that as being AD 70, right? For it was to be immediately after the tribulation of those days. The eclipse and fall were the result of the tribulation which shook the powers of the heavens, civil and ecclesiastical. Okay, now that doesn't mean it's right, but it made me feel better when I was, putting up, okay, I don't agree with these guys. And I felt like, okay, at least I agree with John Thomas. Okay, thus, the idea of the sun, moon, and stars, I think, is all about AD 70. Now, what's it saying then? What's it describing? So let's just try and envision this. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So you get the sun darkening, the moon darkening, the stars falling, and what sounds like a heaven quake. It's something like that. All right. Okay, so something along those lines. Now, here's the thing. When you have different discussions with people, right, they have various ideas, and I remember talking to someone. This was not a Christadelphian. This was a Christian guy that I was having a heated discussion with at one point, and he was very convinced that this was literal, right, so that the stars were going to fall from the sky, the sun would be darkened, so like an eclipse sort of thing. And it's interesting just trying to think through this and trying to figure out, okay, why would we not think that? So if you notice, I think number one, just work through this. What do you think that looks like, the powers of heaven shall be shaken? I mean, if we're talking literally, right? How do you even have a heaven quake? Right? Like, that's not a thing. You can't shake air. I don't think. I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian. So, maybe you guys can figure that out. But I don't think you can, have a heaven quake. Or at least if you did, I don't think anybody would really care if it happened, right? It'd be like, oh, look, the air's shaking. Not a big deal. So what's going on there? So I don't think this can be literal, especially because he then goes on and explains that this heaven and earth will pass away, he says in Matthew 24:35. So that would be challenging if he's talking about the physical heaven and earth, because that kind of flies in the face of everything else in the Bible, right? So what do we do with that? So this can't be literal, because Scripture has a very symbolic definition of the heavens and the earth that fit really well with the prophecies. So let's just walk through and see what's going on there. Now, to me, this is where it gets very exciting, this particular study, because we get to see a pattern that God tends to work with frequently. So check out this pattern. We know about the physical creation in Genesis, and yet God recreates things. And I think sometimes we get so familiar with the Exodus story that we don't notice it, but God recreates things in the Exodus. So listen to the language here. So these are some of the initial indications as we open up the book of Exodus. We read that the children of Israel were fruitful, they multiplied, and the land was filled with them. That's interesting language, right? Does that remind you of anything? That's what God said to Adam and Eve. Same words. So be fruitful, that's your word para. Multiply, ravah. The land, that word up there, the land, Exodus 1 verse 7, is the same as when he says to replenish the earth. It's your word eretz in Hebrew. And then the land being filled is your same word as replenish, malah. So this Exodus 1:17 is totally alluding back to Genesis 1 verse 28. So when we're reading that, we're supposed to think, that's interesting. Israel is fulfilling what Adam and Eve were told to do. I wonder why that is. Why are we told that? And then, as we go through the Exodus story, there's all these links to Israel as a new creation. So I'll give you this one. I think that this is cool. Do you remember how the original creation started? The original creation starts with water, right? The Spirit of God moving on the face of the water. Isn't it interesting then that when God creates Israel as a nation, what does he pull them out of? Water, right? Out of the Red Sea. Yeah, interesting. Okay. Now, he then gives Israel 10 commandments, which, by the way, you can work through this. In fact, Judaism has a name for it. They call it, in Genesis chapter 1, the 10 sayings. So in Genesis 1, they have the 7 days, and then they have the 10 sayings. And God said, and God said, and God said. There's 10 of them. So they call it the 10 sayings, because that's interesting, isn't it? When he brings them out of the Red Sea, where does he take them? Mount Sinai, and he gives them 10 commandments. So it's all these parallels together. Now, we're going to focus specifically on the tabernacle, because I think the tabernacle really brings together this thought. So look at this. If you work through the sections of Exodus 25 through 31, that's where God gives the instructions for the tabernacle. If you work through those sections, you'll find out that there's 7 of them. Just like the days of creation, right? There's 7 sections of the tabernacle. And each begins with God speaking, just like in Genesis. Here they are. Exodus 25:1 says, and the Lord spake unto Moses. Genesis 1 verse 3, God said, right? Beginning of the first day. Exodus 30 verse 11, the Lord spake unto Moses. Genesis 1:6, and God said. Exodus 30:17, the Lord spake unto Moses. Genesis 1:9, and God said. I'm not going to read this all to you. You can read. You get the idea. But I think that this is crazy, right? This is the kind of thing that you look at this and you're like, I don't think a human wrote this book. Right? Like this is pretty clear that there's these structures that are just underlying that really, it doesn't add anything to the story, right? To have this sort of thing. But you look at this and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, there's this parallel here. And it shows up here and here and here and here, and it's pretty unbelievable when you go through this stuff, right? So the Lord spake unto Moses, the Lord spake unto Moses. Those are your 7 sections. And by the way, do you notice what the focus is of the 7th? Listen to this. See if this sounds familiar. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths shall ye keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. No way. The 7th section is about the Sabbath. Go figure. You'll then notice that when the tabernacle is finished, we're told over and over and over that Moses put it together as Yahweh commanded him. Very similar to Genesis, which says, and God saw that it was good. Right? Because if he did it in the same way that God commanded him, it would be good. Exodus 39, verse 32 says, Thus was all the work of the tabernacle finished, which is what we read at the end of creation. Genesis 2:1, Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. Exodus 39:42, the final statement, the ending statement as far as the tabernacle being built, says, Moses looked on all the work, and behold, they had done it as the Lord commanded. Moses looked on all the work. That's an interesting way of putting that. Well, that's because it's the same as Genesis 1:31, right? God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. It's a new creation, right? That's what this is supposed to parallel. It's a new creation that is coming together. And so Moses turns around and blesses everything in the tabernacle. Why? Because that's what God did at the end of creation. It's just one thing after the other after the other. There's all of these parallels that are being put together. So that's why, just as creation had the tree of life in the midst, God says that he would dwell in the midst of the camp. One thing after the other. This is why, if you've ever thought about, why did the high priest, why were there pomegranates everywhere and all these different things? What do you think the tabernacle was supposed to look like? It was Eden. Right? It was supposed to look like a garden. That was the idea. That's why there were cherubim on the veil, because there had been the cherubim in Eden guarding the way to the tree of life. Right? It's just all of these connections here, these parallels. Okay, so there you go. And by the way, they were also facing the same direction. Tabernacle was facing east, Eden was facing east. So you can put all this together. Okay, So over and over, Sinai parallels Eden. Now, why are we talking about this, aside from the fact that it's just exciting? Okay, what does this mean? What's the point? Well, the point of this is that God created a new creation in Israel. At the first creation, it had fallen apart with the fall, so he was making a new one, which I'll just throw this out there because this adds to the excitement level. If you've ever wondered why are there 10 plagues, right? It's because I think the destruction of Egypt is a decreation. So it's the opposite of creation. That God creates with the 10 sayings, he decreates with 10 plagues, right? And you can actually, you can parallel these, right? Like, anyway, we won't get into this, but it's pretty cool, right? It's pretty exciting to see. So when you bring all this together, what you see is that Israel is a new creation, and that is why when we see the symbols in Scripture of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, it almost always is about Israel, because the physical creation was a picture now of the nation of Israel as God's new creation. Right? They were supposed to represent that physical creation. This creation was supposed to be connected to them. And thus, Israel is consistently called the heavens and the earth, because they are God's new creations. So 2:1, give ear, O ye heavens, and hear, O earth. This is Moses singing to the people of Israel. He calls them the heavens and the earth. 1 Chronicles 16:31, let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice. This is what David says when he brings the ark to Jerusalem, and he's wanting all the people to rejoice. Isaiah 1 verse 2 is Isaiah's prophecy to the nation of Judah, and he says, hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth. Isaiah 51 verse 6, the heavens shall vanish away like smoke, and the earth as well. About the destruction of the nation. So what you get here is Israel is consistently described as the heavens, the earth, all of these things together. Okay, now, not always. There are times when heavens and earth refer to other nations, right? You can see them up there on the screen. Occasionally, you will see Isaiah 14. It talks about the king of Babylon and the earth being the people. So there are times where the same model is used for other things, but it's primarily related to Israel. Now then, I think that means that in Matthew 24:29, when we come to immediately after those days, the sun shall be darkened, the moon will not give forth its light. Our context is Israel. Right? We've been seeing this is all about the destruction of Jerusalem, and considering the fact that generally, unless there's a reason not to, Scripture typically uses heavens and earth in reference to Israel or God's people. I think it makes sense for us to understand it that way too. So heavens refers to the government of Israel at the time, or Judea at that time, and the earth is a reference to the people. So then with that in mind, who are the sun, moon, and stars? Well, the role of the sun, moon, and stars is to rule. That's what you see in Genesis 1:26. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So sun, moon, and stars, therefore, represent the rulers of the people, or the rulers of Israel. So I think we see that, again, consistently throughout Scripture. Christ is referred to as a star in Numbers 24:17. Revelation 22:16 talks about him as the bright and morning star. And then again, you can also see it in relation to other nations, like Isaiah 14. Once again, you have that Lucifer word, which means, Lucifer translation. Anybody know Latin? Morning star, yeah. So there you go. By the way, it's one of our Latin words that made its way into the KJV. I find that kind of thing really interesting. Okay, but we don't need to get into that. So, look at what Christ is saying. Understand verse 29 that way. He's saying the Jewish rulers would be eclipsed. They would be darkened, and they would fall from that Jewish heaven. Heaven and earth would thus become desolate, meaning that the powers of the heavens would be shaken. And, that's very much what we see what we just discussed, right, with the Sadducees losing their power, all of that sort of thing. That's exactly what happened at AD 70. And I think what's fascinating about that is if you try and apply that to today, there really is no equivalent today because there is no temple. So there is no ruler within Judaism. There's no high priest. There's no position like that anymore. You have rabbis, and rabbis have influence over their congregation and maybe over their movement, but there is nobody that can say, I speak for Judaism, right, as a whole. That's not really a thing. You have some chief rabbis of countries, but it's not so much really, it doesn't really work. Now, with Christ saying this, that's a pretty bold statement, right? He's not just saying the temple's going to be destroyed, but he's essentially saying the Jewish world is going to disappear. That's the end. That's a real serious kind of, it's very Jeremiah-ish, right? Like, this is all going to go away. Now, what's neat about this is he's not saying it without an Old Testament basis. Did you get that? It's a double negative. Sorry. He has an Old Testament basis. So there we go. He has an Old Testament basis, and I think it's Isaiah chapter 5. So there's an Old Testament basis here for this language. So take a look at this. Throughout that last week of his life, he's been alluding to Isaiah. He's constantly referencing Isaiah. This is Isaiah 5. You remember the Song of the Vineyard? So if you go back to Isaiah chapter 5, you'll see it says, my beloved had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill, right? And it goes on and it discusses this vineyard. I'll show it to you here. It says in verse 2, he fenced it and gathered out the stones thereof and planted it with the choicest vine, built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. He looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. So this is the Song of the Vineyard by Isaiah. Now, notice that Christ in the last week of his life has been bringing up this chapter. In fact, he tells the parable of the vineyard with this as its Old Testament basis. So Christ is consistently having an Old Testament basis to his parables. Isaiah 5 is the Old Testament basis of the parable of the vineyard. I mean, just look at the connections here. He says, Isaiah says, planted with the choicest vine, and Matthew 21:33 says, planted a vineyard, right? Isaiah 5:2 says he fenced it. Matthew 21:33 says he hedged it round about. He made a winepress, digged a winepress. He built a tower, So Christ definitely, I think, is thinking about Isaiah 5 when he tells this parable. In fact, Isaiah asks this question. He says, what could have been done? What more could be done for this vineyard? Is what Isaiah says. And Christ ends his parable with a question. He says, what will he do to those wicked husbandmen? Which, by the way, it's the exact same in the Greek. It's just a tense different. So that's tipoieso versus tipoiese. Anyway, it's the same word. Well, you can see that there's these links between Isaiah 5 and this parable of the vineyard. What's interesting then about that is Isaiah 5 then breaks into this list of woes. I don't know if you've ever looked at that or noticed these in Isaiah 5. They're kind of interesting to mark because they're just woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. You can see it as you go through your chapter. It's your word in the Hebrew. It's the word hoi, which I don't really know where this comes from. I think the etymology of the word is that's like the sound that you would make when you are upset. Like you'd go, hoi, like that sort of thing. I think. I don't know. You guys don't do that? Anyway, I don't know. Well, maybe someday. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, apparently, it's interesting that Christ in Matthew 21 was alluding to Isaiah 5 with the parable of the vineyard, and then you'll note that Isaiah 5, as we discussed, Isaiah 5 brings out those woes, and so does Christ in Matthew 23. Now, get this. Christ uses a Greek word here. You ready for what it is? It's the word oi. Oi. Yes, so by the way, saying oi is biblical. So it's oi. But that's the same word in the Greek as the Hebrew, right? The Hebrew is hoi, but this is oi. So it's interesting to see that. So in other words, like when Christ suddenly breaks into, woe unto you, woe unto you, this is not just random. It's because he's thinking about Isaiah 5, right? He just quoted Isaiah 5 and told this parable of the vineyard, and the people totally didn't get it. So he's like, okay, you didn't get it. Let me be a little more explicit. Woe to you, right? Like he just starts to really look at what is straight out of Isaiah 5, and he uses the same words. Now, here's why that helps us when we come to Matthew 24:29. Listen to this. Isaiah 5 is all about the destruction of Jerusalem. Sounds familiar. Sort of like Matthew 24, right? Look at Isaiah 5, 26 to 29. They shall come with speed swiftly. They shall roar and lay hold of the prey. None shall deliver. That's the destruction of Jerusalem. And that is then followed by these words. Listen to this. See if this reminds you of Matthew 24:29. In that day they shall roar against them like the roaring of the sea. And if one look unto the land, behold, darkness and sorrow, and the light is darkened in the heavens thereof. That's the same idea. Now, Luke's version of this whole sun, moon, and stars being darkened is Luke 21:25, and he adds in the sea and the waves are roaring. Where do you think he got that? Right, that's Isaiah 5, verse 30. The roaring of the sea. Your word there for land in the Septuagint, in the Greek of Isaiah 5, verse 30, is the same as the earth from our Matthew 24:29. Our word there for sorrow is the same as what we get in Luke 21:25 of perplexity. Luke 21:25 says, earth, distress of nations with perplexity. The sun shall be dark and the moon shall not give her light. You can see the light is darkened in the heavens. So Luke and Matthew, you have these two parallel accounts, these two parallel verses, and they both seem to be drawing from Isaiah 5, verse 30. So that suggests to us that we're on the right track here when we're thinking that Christ is thinking back to Isaiah 5. Okay, now, you might think, wow, that was intense. That was like a lot of stuff to think about. Why did we just do that? Well, here's why. Because Isaiah 5 is not just, you guys are going to be destroyed because you're a bunch of losers, right? Wouldn't that be sad? Can you imagine getting a prophecy like that? That'd be terrible. But that's not what God does. That's not what Christ did when Christ alludes back to Isaiah 5. He alludes back to Isaiah 5 because look at where it goes. Isaiah 5 leads into chapter 6 where Isaiah sees God's glory. Do you remember his reaction? He says, woe unto me, I am undone, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I'm in the midst of an unclean people. Why does he feel that way? Well, because Isaiah 5 was all about how terrible everybody was, right? Woe unto you, woe unto you. So like Isaiah's like, oh man, you just like told me how terrible everybody is, everything's bad, life stinks, right? Like this is what he says back to God. And look at what God does. Like this is so, it says, your iniquity is taken away and your sin is purged. Right? He spends a chapter railing against the people, and then he says, you're cleansed. Now go preach to the people. Go help them. Because God wasn't done. This is God's faithfulness. God says, you issues, right? You got to fix this, and you got to fix this, and you got to fix this. But that doesn't mean that he says, so I'm done, goodbye. Right? Like that's not how God does stuff. And that's what's so awesome about the way that he works. Like, what we see here from Christ's alluding back to Isaiah 5 is that he's not saying this is just the destruction, the end, that's it. But he's saying this is the destruction and there's hope because God is who he is. Because God is faithful. He didn't leave the Jews without hope because God is faithful. In fact, it appears that his phrase here finds its Old Testament basis in another verse. There's only one place in the entire Old Testament where the sun, moon, stars, and sea roaring show up together. That's Jeremiah 31:35. Why is that interesting? Well, what's the promise of Jeremiah 31? God says, if you can make all of these things stop, try and make the sun disappear, try and make the moon disappear, try and make the waves stop. If you can do that, then I will forsake Israel. Isn't that fascinating? That Christ pulls out all of those things from that verse because the Old Testament basis says you are not forsaken. Yes, things will get bad. Yes, things will get hard. But God is faithful. God doesn't leave. He doesn't relent. He doesn't give up. God is faithful. That's what that means. I think we just need to let this sink in. Christ is talking about the destruction of the city. And yet, implicit in his words about the destruction are actually words of hope. Right, this is how God does things. He doesn't leave us hopeless. And I think that is something that we can never forget. Sometimes things feel hopeless. Sometimes we don't know what to do. We don't know how to go on. We don't know how to see past what's happening. But God is the God that doesn't let go. That's what it means to be faithful. And he is the God, therefore, that creates hope. He creates hope out of things like destruction. Only God can do that. So, as we come back tomorrow and we move into class numbers 4 and 5, we will then move on from this era of destruction and begin to consider now the coming of the Son of Man, the sign of the Son of Man, and the gathering together of the elect. So we've seen AD 70, and now we'll move on to the future.